The Fear Code. Chapter 1. The Stranger. Jack Reacher leaned back in his booth, feeling the worn leather seat under him as he sipped a freshly brewed cup of coffee. The diner was just another stop along the way, one of those nondescript, middle-of-nowhere towns that faded in memory the moment you left. That suited Reacher fine. He lived by the principle of blending in and leaving quietly. But on this morning, as a storm brewed outside, he felt the first prickle of tension in the air. The door swung open, letting in a gust of icy wind and a young woman who looked like she was running from something or someone. She had on a gray hoodie that was soaked through, and her eyes darted around the room before landing on Reacher. She paused, seemingly making a decision, then walked straight toward him. Her movements were quick, her face pale, with streaks of rain dripping from her short, dark hair. "Are you Jack Reacher?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reacher studied her for a moment before nodding. "Depends. Who's asking?" "Sophie," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to burst in behind her. I need your help." Reacher didn't respond right away. The situation had trouble written all over it, but trouble had a way of finding him, whether he wanted it or not. He motioned for her to sit, and Sophie slid into the booth across from him. "Who sent you?" he asked, voice steady but low. "No one. I just heard. I was told you might be able to help me. My father, he trusted someone who said you're the one who handles things that no one else can." Her hands shook as she reached into her pocket and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. She slid it across the table toward him. Reacher unfolded it carefully, revealing a page covered in strange symbols and numbers. Some parts were underlined, and a faint coffee stain blurred the edges. At first glance, it looked like gibberish, but Reacher knew codes when he saw them. "What am I looking at?" he asked, never taking his eyes off the page. "My father worked for the government, in intelligence," she explained, voice barely audible. He was killed 2 months ago, and before he died, he left this for me. He said it was important, that it could ruin people if it got out. But I don't know what it means, and there are people following me. They want this code, and they'll do anything to get it." Reacher looked from the paper to her, reading the fear etched in her expression. This wasn't just paranoia. This was real terror, the kind that only came from being chased by men willing to cross any line. "All right," he said slowly, "I'll take a look. But you need to tell me everything you know. Every last detail about your father, his work, and why this code matters." She swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay, but we can't stay here. They've been tracking me. I think they're close." As if on cue, the bell above the door chimed, and 2 men entered, each with cold, assessing eyes that scanned the room. Sophie's face went white. Reacher could tell by her reaction that they weren't just random customers. They were here for her. "Get up," Reacher muttered, standing. "And stay close." With the crumpled page tucked into his coat pocket, Reacher guided Sophie out the back exit, leaving the 2 men in the diner. They slipped into the alley behind the building, the rain now pouring in a heavy sheet around them, masking their footsteps. "Where do we go?" Sophie asked, shivering in the cold. Reacher scanned the narrow alley, his mind already calculating a dozen possible routes, strategies, and contingencies. "First, we get off the grid. After that, we find out what your father really left behind." But deep down, Reacher had a feeling this wouldn't be easy. Whoever those men were, they weren't amateurs. And if the code was as dangerous as Sophie claimed, they'd need to stay ahead of more than just 2 pursuers. They'd need to outsmart an entire network. What did you think? Subscribe and share to see how Reacher will handle this deadly conspiracy. Chapter 2. The Pursuit. The rain intensified, creating a thick curtain around them as Reacher and Sophie moved quickly through the alley. Reacher's mind raced, mapping out every escape route in the area. A code that could ruin people and cause men to hunt her across state lines? This was bigger than Sophie realized. They turned the corner into a darker side street just as headlights swept across the opposite end of the alley. Reacher didn't stop moving, but he kept his hand firmly on Sophie's shoulder, steering her toward an abandoned building nearby. He nudged open a broken door, and they slipped inside, their breaths heavy as they listened to the sounds outside. "They'll have a team," Reacher murmured, scanning the empty, crumbling room. "Likely blocking every exit out of town by now." Sophie looked pale in the dim light, and her hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself. "I didn't think they'd find me so fast. I don't even know how they've been tracking me." Reacher glanced at her coat pocket, then her wrist, noting the sleek, modern watch she wore. He held out his hand. "Hand over the watch." She blinked, taken aback. "My watch. Trust me. If they've been following you that precisely, there's a tracker on you somewhere." "Watch is my first guess." Sophie hesitated but slipped off the watch, placing it in his hand. Reacher studied it for a second before flinging it out a shattered window. They listened as the sound of it cracking against the pavement faded into the night. "All right," Reacher said. "Now, let's go over what you know. You said your father was in intelligence. What branch?" She closed her eyes, thinking back, and answered, "He worked for an agency specialized in cryptology. The kind that deals with national threats." "Cryptology," Reacher repeated, feeling the weight of the situation start to settle in. "And you're telling me this piece of paper he left you could compromise someone?" She nodded, seeming lost for words. "My dad, he was a paranoid guy. He always said his job required it, that you couldn't trust anyone, even those on the same side. After he died, someone showed up at my door, claiming they were from his agency. They asked for the paper, for security reasons. But they didn't have any proof, so I told them I didn't have it." Reacher gave a sharp nod. "Smart move. Now you know why they're after you. It's likely that paper holds something damaging, a secret someone high up once buried. Your father left it to you, knowing they'd come looking for it." A sound echoed from outside, the scrape of boots over concrete. Reacher motioned for Sophie to stay quiet, pressing his back against the wall as footsteps approached the building. He held up 2 fingers, signaling 2 pursuers. The footsteps paused just outside, followed by the low murmur of voices. Reacher glanced down at Sophie, signaling her to stay low and silent. He knew they couldn't stay in the building for long. Sooner or later, their pursuers would come in and sweep the place. They needed a new plan, and fast. Suddenly, the voices stopped, replaced by the distinct click of a radio. Reacher's sharp hearing picked up the words. "South Alley's clear. Move to Sector 4. They'd have maybe 5 minutes before those men circled back." Reacher gave Sophie a signal to follow him as he led her through a rusted side door and into an overgrown courtyard behind the building. They moved in silence until they reached a side street, where Reacher noticed an old car parked under a tree. Sophie frowned. "Do you know how to?" "Of course I do," Reacher said with a faint smirk. He moved to the driver's side. A few precise motions later the car was hot-wired and purring to life. They climbed in, and Reacher took them out of town as fast as he could without drawing attention. It wasn't until they were on the outskirts, the lights of the town disappearing behind them, that Sophie finally let out a shaky breath. "Where are we going?" she asked. "We need somewhere to work out this code, somewhere safe. But first, I have to get a better idea of what we're dealing with." Reacher glanced at her. "You're sure this is the only copy?" She nodded. "It's the only one he left." Reacher tapped his fingers on the steering wheel thoughtfully. "Whoever they are, they're well-funded, likely government-affiliated. If they have assets like that team back there, they won't stop until they get what they want. And if we're dealing with intelligence secrets, this could get bigger than just a couple of thugs and a code." Sophie swallowed, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "I just want this to end. They've turned my life into a nightmare. Reacher gave her a brief, steady look. "Stick with me. They'll regret ever starting this." As they drove on into the night, Reacher felt the old instincts kicking in. Whatever was hidden in that code was worth more than he or Sophie realized. And he was certain of one thing: the chase had only just begun. Excited to see what happens next? Share and subscribe to follow Reacher's daring moves as he unravels the fear code. Chapter 3. The Decipher. The rain had eased by the time they pulled into the outskirts of a rural area, miles away from the town where they'd nearly been cornered. Reacher parked the car under a dense cover of trees, where the branches stretched overhead, casting long shadows in the dim light of the moon. For the first time since they'd fled, Sophie seemed to catch her breath. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Safe, for now," Reacher replied, keeping his eyes on their surroundings. "But if we're going to get to the bottom of this, I need to understand everything about that code." Sophie nodded and pulled out the crumpled paper from her jacket. She smoothed it carefully, her hands still trembling as she unfolded the mysterious sheet covered in sequences of numbers, symbols, and letters. At first glance, it looked chaotic, but Reacher's trained eyes could sense a pattern beneath the surface. "I haven't been able to make any sense of it," she admitted. "But I know my father would never leave it to me without a reason." Reacher leaned over, scanning the page. The code was dense, likely ciphered in multiple layers. Whoever created it was no amateur, but Reacher had faced cryptic messages before. He picked out a few sequences that seemed familiar, some military jargon, a few references that could mean locations or events. "Your father was in cryptology, right?" Reacher asked, studying her face. "Yes," Sophie said, looking down. "But he never talked about work at home. I know he had clearance for high-level projects. Things he said were too classified for civilians to understand." Reacher continued to analyze the page, then gestured to a particular line. "What about this? Does this set of numbers mean anything to you?" Sophie's brow furrowed as she examined the sequence. "Those are coordinates," she whispered, her voice filled with sudden recognition. "They lead to a place near our family cabin in the Adirondacks. It was somewhere he'd go to get away from the world." Reacher looked at her, a flicker of approval in his gaze. "Then that's our first destination. If he embedded that location in the code, it's where he left the next clue." Before Sophie could respond, a light flashed in the distance. Reacher's senses sharpened instantly. "Get down," he hissed, pulling her close against the base of the car. The headlights swept over the trees, pausing only briefly, but enough to send a fresh wave of adrenaline through them both. "They're back," Sophie murmured, her eyes wide. "How do they keep finding us?" Reacher's mind raced. These agents weren't just well-funded, they had technology that could track a person's every move. "They're not following you, they're following the document," he realized, his voice barely audible. She frowned. "The document?" Certain agencies use tracers embedded in classified material, like encrypted pages, he explained. "It's how they keep track of high-risk documents. We'll need to move, and fast." Reacher folded the page carefully, slipping it back into his coat. Sophie's pulse raced as she watched him. The calm precision in his every move was both terrifying and reassuring. Reacher had been through situations like this before, but he knew they had only hours, maybe less, before their pursuers caught up again. "We head to the Adirondacks," he said, starting the engine. "We'll work out the next part of the code there, but once we reach those coordinates, be ready for anything. Whoever's after us won't hesitate." As they drove off into the night, Sophie felt the weight of her father's legacy more than ever. The code, once just symbols on a page, had taken on a life of its own, a secret worth killing for. And with Reacher by her side, she began to understand that escaping this conspiracy was going to take everything they had. Want to see where Reacher and Sophie's journey takes them next? Subscribe and share to join the suspense of the Fear Code. Chapter 4. The Cabin. By dawn, they had crossed into the Adirondacks, the dense forest stretching endlessly around them as they navigated winding, rugged roads. The early light filtered through the trees, casting shadows that seemed to shift with the breeze. Reacher stayed alert, his eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the endless forest before them. Sophie sat beside him, her face pale with exhaustion. They had driven through the night, taking random detours to throw off their pursuers. The further they drove, the more Sophie felt the weight of her father's message and the danger that it had brought down upon them. Up ahead, she whispered, pointing to an overgrown path. "The cabin's that way. It's hidden off-road." Reacher steered the car down the narrow track, feeling the vehicle struggle over roots and stones until a small, weather-beaten cabin came into view. The place looked abandoned, with a thin layer of moss creeping up the sides, but it offered the isolation they needed. "Your father kept anything here? Supplies, backup resources?" Reacher asked as they approached the door. "Yes," she replied, her voice thick with memory. "He always had an emergency kit here, just in case." He believed in being prepared. Reacher nodded approvingly. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A wooden table sat near the center, surrounded by chairs. A small stove and cabinets lined one wall, and Sophie quickly located a false panel in the floor, revealing a metal box hidden below. "Bingo," Reacher muttered, pulling the box up onto the table and unlocking it. Inside, they found a map, an old radio, some water purifiers, a few rounds of ammunition, and a leather-bound notebook marked with her father's initials. Sophie's eyes widened as she opened the notebook, flipping through pages filled with careful, coded notes. Diagrams, strings of numbers, and phrases written in shorthand filled the margins. Reacher leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the contents. "It's a cipher key," he said slowly, piecing together what he was seeing. "Your father left instructions to decode the message he left you. Smart. It'll tell us how to interpret the symbols." As they worked through the first few pages, Sophie began to decipher portions of the coded message on the original document. Her father's notes revealed sequences of numbers that corresponded with locations and keywords, a trail of breadcrumbs he had left, layer by layer. But as they progressed, Reacher's brow furrowed. "These numbers," he tapped one of the sequences. "These are coordinates. Not just any coordinates, though. These are sites where government assets have been hidden." Sophie's face went pale as she realized what it meant. "You think my father was part of some kind of black ops?" He always hinted that his work was dangerous, but he never said more. "Looks that way," Reacher replied. "He was hiding the locations of safe houses, intelligence drop points, things that, if exposed, would destroy decades of work and expose agents around the world. No wonder they want this document." Sophie's mind raced. The implications were staggering: her father's life, the danger she now faced, all because of a secret he'd kept hidden in plain sight. But before she could process it, the faint sound of a car engine reached them from the distance. Reacher froze, listening closely, his instincts sharpening as he sensed the familiar rhythm of a convoy. They had been found. "Downstairs," he whispered urgently. "There's no time. They're coming." They scrambled into the cellar below, barely closing the door when they heard footsteps approaching the cabin. Reacher peered through a small gap, watching as two men in dark tactical gear moved quietly toward the building, their weapons drawn. The men were professionals, moving in sync as they scouted the perimeter and entered the cabin. Sophie held her breath, clutching her father's notebook tightly as Reacher gave her a look that said stay quiet. Above them, the men moved quickly, overturning furniture and tearing through drawers, searching for any sign of the code. The minutes stretched in tense silence, every sound amplified in the darkness. Then, a loud crash broke the stillness. One of the men cursed, clearly frustrated, and the other replied, "We're wasting time. If they were here, they've already moved on." Reacher tensed, listening carefully. The men exchanged a few more words before he heard the telltale sound of retreating footsteps. They moved outside, and moments later, the engine started up again, fading as the convoy drove back down the trail. He waited another tense moment, ensuring they were clear, then gestured for Sophie to follow him up. They emerged into the cabin, surveying the mess the men had left behind. "They know we're close," Reacher said, looking at the map and notebook still on the table. "We don't have much time. What do we do now?" Sophie asked, her voice thick with worry. "We finished decoding," Reacher replied, gathering the documents. "Then, we figure out who's running this operation and what they're so desperate to protect." As they exited the cabin, Reacher felt the stakes growing by the second. Sophie's father had known too much, and now, so did they. Whatever secrets this code held, it was big enough to shake foundations. And Reacher wasn't leaving without finding the truth. Eager to see where Reacher's investigation leads? Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chapter in the Fear Code. Chapter 5. The Final Cipher. They drove south, ducking down narrow back roads and weaving through empty rural stretches. The evening sun was setting, casting an amber glow on the fields and winding roads. Sophie, hunched over her father's notebook, was piecing together the final clues, murmuring patterns of numbers and letters under her breath, her face creased with concentration. Reacher, his gaze flicking between her and the rearview mirror, could see they were close. Sophie's father had woven his secrets into a puzzle so intricate that only someone with true knowledge of his mind would decipher it, and Sophie was the key. Hours passed, and the tension in the car grew as the pieces began to fit together. Then, at a rest stop surrounded by trees, Sophie looked up, her eyes wide with realization. I think I have it," she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and dread. "This last part, it's an address, but not just any address. It's in D.C., at a federal archive that stores classified operations." Reacher took the notebook from her, eyes narrowing as he scanned the coordinates and phrases her father had left behind. The words "archival site" and Tier 1 leaped out at him. This wasn't just a personal message. Her father had left behind a breadcrumb trail leading to physical evidence stored deep within government walls. "If this location is accurate," Reacher said, his voice steady, "it's going to reveal everything they've been hiding. It'll be solid proof of this conspiracy." They shared a look, understanding the weight of what they held in their hands. Sophie's father had risked everything to expose something dark within the agency. Now it was their job to finish what he'd started. "Are you ready?" Reacher asked her, his tone serious. She nodded, her determination clear. "Whatever it takes. I'm not letting his message die." The streets of Washington, D.C., bustled with the usual late-night activity as Reacher parked the car in an unmarked lot, blocks away from their target. They walked the rest of the way, blending in with the crowd, but keeping their pace brisk and focused. Reacher knew that once inside, they'd need to move fast. The address Sophie's father had left led to a building used for storing declassified documents, but certain vaults within held secrets that were never intended to see the light of day. Sophie gripped the notebook tightly as they entered the building. The security was minimal, with only a few guards stationed in the lobby and basic ID checks. But Reacher knew they wouldn't be staying in the public areas for long. They slipped down a hallway, past rooms filled with rows of file cabinets, and followed Sophie's father's instructions to a service elevator at the end. "This is it," Sophie whispered, pressing the button that led to the lower archives. They descended in tense silence, the hum of the elevator amplifying every sound. When the doors opened, they found themselves in a cold, dimly lit corridor lined with metal doors marked only by numbers. Reacher pulled the notebook from his coat, checking the last few notes Sophie's father had written. "Vault B47, he murmured, scanning the numbers on the doors. "That's our target." They reached the door labeled B47, and Sophie entered the code her father had hidden in his notes. The door clicked open, revealing a small room lined with shelves holding folders, tapes, and a computer terminal in the corner. "This is what he wanted us to find," Sophie breathed, moving toward a locked cabinet marked with a red label, "Highly Confidential." Reacher forced the lock open, revealing a single manila folder inside, thick with classified documents. He flipped it open, and they both scanned the first few pages. Photographs, operational reports, lists of names. It was a comprehensive dossier, chronicling years of covert actions and unauthorized intelligence operations. Each document pointed back to a single organization buried within the agency, a Black Ops division designed to eliminate threats without any accountability. "This is it," Reacher muttered. "This is what they've been protecting." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Reacher looked up sharply, his instincts on high alert. They'd been found. He grabbed the folder, tucking it under his arm as he signaled Sophie to stay behind him. Two men appeared in the doorway, dressed in dark suits and armed, their expressions cold and calculating. One of them spoke, his voice like ice. "Mr. Reacher. Miss Taylor. You've taken something that doesn't belong to you." Reacher held his ground, his gaze steady. "It belongs to the people. And your agency's crimes end here." The men exchanged a look, unfazed. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This information could bring down governments. We're simply protecting national security." "National security," Reacher repeated with a smirk. "Convenient excuse to bury anything and anyone who gets in your way, isn't it?" Without another word, the men raised their weapons. But Reacher moved first, his training kicking in as he surged forward, using the narrow space to his advantage. He disarmed the first man with a swift motion, slamming him against the wall. The second man tried to raise his gun, but Sophie, with surprising agility, kicked it out of his hand, sending it skidding across the floor. In seconds, it was over. The two men were unconscious on the floor, and Reacher and Sophie were already heading back toward the elevator, the folder clutched tightly in Reacher's grip. They reached the lobby just as the first alarms started to sound, but by then they were already out the door, blending into the busy streets. They found an unmarked post office box a few blocks away, and Reacher deposited copies of the documents, mailing them to a handful of trusted journalists and human rights organizations. With the originals in hand, they drove through the night, leaving DC behind as they watched the city lights fade in the rearview mirror. As dawn broke, Sophie looked over at Reacher, a weary but grateful smile on her face. "We did it," she said softly. "My father's message, it's finally out there." Reacher nodded, his gaze on the road ahead. "Your father was a brave man. And you finished his work. The truth will be exposed, one way or another." They drove on, knowing that the information would soon shake the foundations of the agency and bring justice to those who had tried to bury it. Sophie had fulfilled her father's final wish, and Reacher, as always, moved forward, ready for whatever came next. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.